Before we begin, please subscribe and click the bell to get notified whenever I post new content. I'll also have more videos annotated at the end card, including more of me talking about Final Fantasy and Square Enix. Thanks. Now may the blessing of the crystal go with you. Final Fantasy is an institution. There's a special place in my heart for my first Final Fantasy, which was the first Final Fantasy. I was living in Asia at the time, and here was this weird game that wasn't about beating a level or getting a high score. No, it was a journey of warriors, conscripted by fate to save the world. My fascination was palpable, and the feeling only became more deeply rooted in my soul over the years as I've continued to play each new Final Fantasy title. Yet for how stalwart the series has been in the gaming industry, the individual titles were never afraid to experiment with their core identities. Final Fantasy VII dared to ask, why can't fantasy mean dystopian steampunk futurism? Final Fantasy XI said, does this series work as an MMO? Final Fantasy Tactics posited, what if the Tactics Ogre team made Final Fantasy? And Final Fantasy VIII opined, what if Final Fantasy wasn't that fun? All jokes aside, Square Enix is framed by two monoliths. On one side, the unwavering Dragon Quest, the benchmark for all turn-based role-playing games. And on the other, the enduring Final Fantasy, a series never afraid to change its stripes. Final Fantasy XVI is no different. From its story to its gameplay, 16's mission statement asks, why can't Final Fantasy mature with its audience? Set in the world of Valisthea, Final Fantasy XVI is rich in world politics and bathed in blood. The legendary Mother Crystals, responsible for bestowing magical power, are slowly losing their blessings. This, in turn, ravages the life of the land, an event dubbed the Blight. In the face of magical ruin, Valisthea's nations all vie for control of the Mother Crystals. Each Mother Crystal is championed by an elemental being known as an Icon, and Icon spirits select a human with whom to entwine. The entwined user is thus dubbed a Dominant, a human capable of invoking the Icon's powers. Non-dominant, crystalless magic users are known as Bearers, but utilizing magical powers drains the life force of both Bearer and Dominant alike. Due to their innate abilities, Bearers are enslaved, tattooed, and used for labor, all in the name of preserving the crystals for as long as possible. 16's story follows Clive, firstborn prince of the Grand Duchy of Rosaria. 3 years after an assault by the Holy Empire of Sanbreque, Clive has been branded as a bearer and seeks his revenge against those that crossed his family. That is a very dense synopsis of the premise, and the actual story remains dense throughout. However, the richness and detail in Final Fantasy XVI is reminiscent of my favorite Final Fantasy games, the compilation of Final Fantasy VII and the Evilus Alliance. 16's world building is complex, and it makes the story equally daunting and engrossing. Even in its earliest hours, I was mesmerized. Where 16 succeeds over something like the Fabula Nova Crystallis is in its story's accessibility. Should you ever get lost, you can pause any cutscene and pull up a compendium of relevant information, a feature known as the Active Time Lore. Active Time Lore fleshes out characters, relationships, interactions, and motivations relevant to the scene being displayed. All glossary entries can be viewed in the 1000 Tomes feature, and the data logs update in time as new information is revealed to the player. Before the game was released, I have to admit that I was anxious. I felt the inclusion of this feature meant the story would be convoluted and impermeable without added reading. In order to test this theory, I purposefully didn't utilize the feature aside from recording footage here. I wanted to see how much I understood the events of the game without consulting a compendium. Thankfully, I was wrong, as I didn't have any trouble following the story as presented. Active Time Lore simply accentuates more of the content and adds further subtext and color to the events unfolding. Rather than being a crutch like in Final Fantasy XIII, the data logs here are merely supplemental. In my opinion, Final Fantasy XVI features one of the finer stories yet told in this illustrious series. The dialogue writing alone is great, because conversations weren't chock full of speeches that made me cringe. If I have one complaint, it's unsurprisingly the most polarizing detail. I wish the world was more diverse. And before you tell me that it wouldn't be realistic for medieval Europe, just know that 1. My stance on its diversity is my opinion, 2. You're factually incorrect, please read about the Moors from the Middle East that settled many parts of Europe, 3. Parts of the game were inspired by the Middle East and Northern Africa. And 4. Even if the lack of diversity was aiming for realism, Final Fantasy XVI has fucking dragons in it. Yeah, super period accurate. As far as looks, 16's visuals are interesting. Let's start at the bottom and work our way up. The facial designs have proven polarizing and are at times outright dated, to say the least. Hair effects are also lacking, specifically with the natural movement of hair. Compare the stiffer blades of Final Fantasy XVI to the more free-flowing follicles of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now on to the positive bullet points. Texture and material work are outright incredible. Nowhere is that more evident than the outfits. Different pieces of attire and armor have different visual properties, from the varying lattices of threadwork and clothing to the way each material plays with light. Global illumination is beautiful as expected. Though the game doesn't utilize dynamic time of day, this allows the lighting of each area to be carefully curated, resulting in gorgeous visuals at scale. However, local illumination is where I was most impressed. In-world objects cast light in an authentic manner, and the shadows for both global and environmental lighting are fabulous. Specular highlights and reflections look really good too. Again, just look at how the blades and the chainmail and plate mail all catch and reflect light differently. Combined with the textures in-game, things like ambient occlusion, bloom, and even the cascade and dissipation of light over broad surfaces really sell the atmosphere of each differing in-game region. Add in the particle effects of combat, and you have a really gorgeous-looking game in action. The technical notes are less promising. Final Fantasy XVI has two visual presentations, graphics mode and frame rate mode. Graphics mode runs at an upscaled 2160p and 30 frames per second. Frame rate mode is a dynamic 1080p with an uncapped 60 FPS. Neither really hit their benchmarks that well. Graphics mode is more consistent in its delivery, but some crowded areas see the frame rate drop into the 20s. It's not too bad, and most of the game manages to stay locked at 30 FPS. In short, it's serviceable and unremarkable. For frame rate mode, exploration on average is 40-ish FPS. Surprisingly, battles usually manage to scrape out 60 frames per second, but the game sacrifices image resolution to compensate. Video quality dips as deep as an upsampling of 720p, and the game can look outright smudgy at times, especially on a larger video display. Some smaller notes: before version 1.03, you couldn't turn off or even reduce the motion blur. This definitely made the game look worse, especially when coupled with each presentation format's complications. While motion blur sensitivity isn't a problem for some players, others are more susceptible to its effects, myself included. Thankfully, 1.03 added an option to adjust and even completely disable motion blur, and it's a game changer. 16's motion blur didn't make me actually vomit the way Final Fantasy Type 0 HD did, but I'll take a clear image over a blotchy mess any day. Some downsides of note: removing motion blur really exacerbates the issues of frame rate mode to the naked eye, most prominently any inclement frame pacing issues. Disabling motion blur also reveals what appears to be checkerboarding in the foreground when the camera is in motion, most likely due to the image upscaling happening in both performance settings. And while the major cutscenes are the same Final Fantasy spectacles that we know and love, the canned animations of minor cutscenes are stiff by comparison. These scenes make the game look decidedly worse, especially in frame rate mode's lowest visual resolutions. Alas, given both modes' struggles, I spent much of my time in graphics mode for its ironically more consistent frame rate. Aside from the technical issues, however, which aren't too significant so much as they are disappointing, I think Final Fantasy XVI looks great. Despite the fact that I wish the presentation settings were better optimized, there are a lot of impressive cogs working in tandem here to deliver that trademark eye-catching Final Fantasy. It is no exaggeration to say Final Fantasy XVI's soundtrack is incredible. Pretty much every Final Fantasy game has great music, and this one follows the same trend. One thing I made a point of doing this time around was sitting down and listening for classic series leitmotifs in any given track. I really love how 16 balances its more mature themes with the series' everlasting traditions and tropes. Oftentimes, the long-standing musical stings are rearranged in minor key to change the emotional impact of the scene unfolding. Have a listen for yourself. I already mentioned that the dialogue writing is improved, but the voice acting is fabulous as well. There are a suite of options, but I only looked at English and Japanese. Japanese was great, but it felt clear to me that Final Fantasy XVI was made to be played in English. There are the obvious reasons, like the European-inspired aesthetic and setting. However, the most obvious detail is the lip syncing, which has been tailored for the English dialogue. Luckily, I think the English voiceover is the definitive language option for 16. You can compare both and decide for yourself.
気をつけてね。
増票など召喚獣の前ではちりあくた。俺の力を疑ってるのか？
いいえ、全然。あなたを信じてるわ。愛してるもの。
召喚獣芝だろうがすぐに片付ける。いいか、戻ったら覚悟しておけよ。
Take care.
Does the lion take care when he chases the hare? Or do you think me one of the latter?
No, my love. You are a lion. You're my lion.
I'm not afraid of a little frost, Benedicta. But I will need someone to warm me when I come home.
If for no other reason, the English voice acting is definitive for Ralph Ineson's portrayal of Cid alone.
This place. These are fallen ruins. Well, we didn't think they'd mind. And it keeps the black from our lungs.
But how do you survive without magic?
How does anyone? Hard work and a bit of nous. You must be starving. We grow them here, believe it or not.
Along with the story, the gameplay is the starkest change from classic Final Fantasy. Combat feels more like Devil May Cry than Final Fantasy thanks to 16's combat director, Ryota Suzuki. Suzuki's resume boasts plenty of Capcom staples, including Devil May Cry 5 and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Though Final Fantasy XV was the main series' first action RPG, the gameplay in its successor feels far more interactive. Square is your basic melee attack, triangle is your basic magic attack, X is jump, and circle is your special icon ability. R1 is dodge, and if you evade at the last second, you'll engage a brief bullet time sequence where you can deal a more damaging attack. If you manage to hit the enemy as their own attack connects, this will count as a parry, canceling your foe's attack and empowering your own. Stagger makes its return from Final Fantasy XIII and XV and is functionally similar. Dealing greater and more diverse damage to your opponent leaves them temporarily stunned, and your hits during this period receive an increased damage multiplier. You can also hold R2 and press either triangle or square to use an icon attack, a powerful strike with a long cooldown period. Torgal, your loyal canine companion, can also be used for battle. Pressing left on the D-pad switches between the item quick menu and Torgal's command menu. Up, right, and down each dictate a move for Torgal to use, which can open up a lot more avenues for combat chains. For magic, Clive can switch between different blessings with L2, altering his related elemental affinity and icon attacks. Finally, there are limit breaks, wherein Clive enters an enhanced state with various benefits. I have to say, it is really fun to engage in battles. Combat feels weighty, and the ins and outs of battle are so smooth and intuitive. I particularly like how the icon abilities allow for different modes of play. My friends and I each used different icon loadouts, and we would talk about our preferred strategies. It was a blast mowing down enemies with lengthy, particle effect riddled combos, and I hope Final Fantasy continues along this game design path. Between 16 and the 7 remake chronology, I don't think Final Fantasy can ever go back to being turn-based. Outside of battle, the world map is divided into regions. In form and function, Final Fantasy XVI's world map is similar to Final Fantasy XII and also strangely Dragon Age Inquisition. Gone is the open world design of Eos, replaced instead with Valisthea's smaller interconnected zones. While there are vocal opponents to the lack of an open world, I welcome the return of more classic Final Fantasy map design. Individual areas are typically linear like Final Fantasy XIII, but incorporate larger, more spacious landscapes to explore, and regions can be freely revisited as you progress further into the story. There are also towns and rest stops where you can catch your breath, all of which helps in keeping 16 from feeling like you're being funneled into a tight corridor. Looking at the bigger picture, I thought the gameplay was an engaging mashup of novel functionalities and renewed concepts. As much as I love turn-based combat, the free-flowing action of Clive and company feels so much more modern. And I'm a sucker for anything like Final Fantasy XII, so 16's region layout being a vague facsimile of its forebear is a huge win for me. My sole complaint is the heavy reliance on fetch quests, which plague the side quests and pacing like a blight from yesteryear's game design. Still, I enjoyed playing through 16, and I'm excited to see what the future holds for the series. If I could sum up Final Fantasy XVI in a word, I would call it purposeful. Everything is so deliberate in its design and implementation, both the good and the not so good. The story is lush in its themes, the gameplay is carefully laid out, the music is masterful in execution, and the visuals are thoughtfully crafted, even down to the not always impressive benchmarks. And there was plenty of little or personal stuff that resonated with me. I love the way the sword is stowed away on Clive's shoulder pauldron to prevent clipping with his clothing. I love the strength and significance with which the series' classic summons are portrayed, especially with how obfuscated it was to call summons in Final Fantasy XV.
Yo, this music! Oh my god, this music is fucking good!
Bum 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 dun 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 dun. And I love how much Final Fantasy XII DNA has been suffused throughout Valisthea. The zonal map design, that's from Final Fantasy XII. The hunt board, that's from Final Fantasy XII. The European history-inspired political intrigue, that's from Final Fantasy XII. The departure from classic series gameplay, that's from Final Fantasy XII. The flood of ether magic causing people to frenzy, that's from Final Fantasy XII. While Evilus remains the more beautiful, rich, and diverse universe, Final Fantasy XVI feels like it has only scratched the surface of Valisthea, and I want to see more of this world sooner than later. One final test. Would this game still be considered good if it wasn't emblazoned with the Final Fantasy name, if it was called Medieval Clive and also there's a dog featuring Dante from the Devil May Cry series? Personally, I'm gonna say yes. For all its uniformity and fetch questing, I still enjoyed my time in Valisthea as much as I had hoped. The game delivers in many of the ways that matter, and I seriously haven't played a new, numbered Final Fantasy this good since the PlayStation 2. I can only hope that I won't have to wait even half as long for the next great Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy XVI on PlayStation 5 earns a 9 out of 10. Thanks for watching, please subscribe, click the bell, and check out my other content, including my other Square Enix videos. Arigatou gozaimasu. Minasan, go kigenyo. Sayonara.